Okay, Mambo Swamiji.
Yes,
Uh,
Hoa.
how about
Yeah,
it?
yeah,
So
Missouri. Yeah,
we don't speak KwaZulu or Afrikaans, but a little bit of Swahili.
that's
So
right.
when have you been in Africa the last time?
March when I left, March 2017.
Okay, quite some time.
Yeah. So that was last year. Yeah,
Yeah, same with me here.
yeah.
Yeah, so today we're doing a bit of an unorthodox interview about the astrology behind South Africa, its current
Right.
situation, and
Yeah.
comparison a little bit, if possible, to Zimbabwe in 2000 and onwards.
Right.
And I'm going to do a brief introduction. Maybe I have been in DRC in 2017, I think, for 1 month.
Right.
And really remember how I experienced the anarchy there and the chaos. And still people, I mean, they had food. There was still commerce going on and trade with foreign countries, of course, because they have a lot of raw minerals there and materials. And I also have a good friend in Cape Town who is a Dutch person, actually, who is married to a girl from DRC, and they're very happy together. And I remember that a lot of people in South Africa are coming from DRC and migrated from DRC, Congo, basically, for those who don't know the abbreviations. And also a lot of people from Mozambique and also Zimbabwe went to. So South Africa is basically an immigration country, and what most people don't know that even under apartheid regime, there was a constant influx of Black African people into South Africa for economical reasons mainly. So there is at least a good number of people from Zimbabwe now living in South Africa and having gone through the Zimbabwe experience before. And there has been an uptick of interest regarding South African politics, even in the West, the past months. And there's a lot going on with land, proposals to take land from white farmers mostly. And redistribute it very similar to what Mugabe did in 2000 onwards in Zimbabwe. So that therefore I would be quite interested, or I was quite interested since a long time, if you can see any similarities between Zimbabwe and South Africa, because they're on-ramp to this crisis, which could also develop into a food crisis, and economical crisis is a bit similar. Though Zimbabwe is quite economically rich country, but it's of course the economy is not as strong and never has been as South Africa. So South Africa is basically with Nigeria the powerhouse of Africa, and I think in Gauteng alone there's 20 or 30% of the total economic revenue of the whole of Africa. The whole of African continent is created there. So it's a bit apples and oranges, but maybe you can say something about that.
Yeah. Well, actually, first of all, I was looking at the timing. I know in Zimbabwe got independence on 18th of April, 1980, and that was at midnight. In fact, I was aware of that. But I don't remember when South Africa got independence. I think that was midnight also, right?
I have no idea. I looked at it, but I mean, there has been many independencies and dependencies again.
Right. But we'll take when Mandela got when that transfer happened. That's the present independence.
Yeah, but
took a shift. Yeah.
But is it really because it was? The constitution did not really change, no, and the country itself. I mean, there was just a shift of power, no, or was there really a new foundation of?
Yeah, I would take it as a completely new change because you had like when, for instance, when the whites took over from the British, they got independence from the British. There was not a whole lot of change. It was independence, no doubt. Yeah. But the apartheid system was a complete shift in South Africa. So when apartheid ended and the majority took over, that, whether we call it independence or not, is essentially the time frame for this country.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I trust your intuition here. It's otherwise difficult.
So to me, I'm taking it, and then it also plays out. If I look at it historically, since '94, what has happened? You see the trends; they're more or less similar. So I would take it that way. So I can talk about. Well, there's actually no comparison between Zimbabwe and South Africa, so I can talk about them separately. There are certain things that are common between them in terms of the culture and some of the challenges that all African countries face, which is when you have sort of like the Westerners or the whites who run the farms, and then they get taken over by Africans or by locals. They seem to fail to maintain the level of production that was there before, and that can be attributed to a lot of things. But the fact of the matter is that a lot of the large-scale farming that was done by whites cannot easily be managed with the takeover by locals. So,
I mean maybe to just inject some information that most people will not know. I mean, the farming in South Africa, because it's a semi-arid country, it's quite technical and very difficult to do, and it's a high-tech farming. You need to bring water from either deep wells or channel it from somewhere. And it's not very easy to do, and it's very specialized, I would say. So that's one thing, and I've heard figures, and I think they are correct, that about 2,000 people are fed by one white farmer. They're usually white farmers in South Africa, and so that would basically, it sounds quite alarming also, because if you have like Russia, I think, announced recently that they would take white South African refugees a certain amount.
They are. Yeah, they are. In fact, I was watching a documentary, and the South Africans are doing very well. There was also a Nigerian minister many years ago who invited Zimbabwean whites to come and farm, and who would provide land, and they're doing very well. So because they have certain skills, and the skills they've been learning it for generations. It's not that you learn these skills overnight, or you go to college and learn how to farm and then go out and try to farm. So there's a lot of cultural inheritance that takes place to keep these large-scale farming working.
And I think it's very different from, let's say, lush Mozambican South or such areas where it's easy to farm for even small farmers. And I also, when I was in Zambia, I remember talking to some people, and they told me that basically, I think 200 white farmers from Zimbabwe were coming to Zambia and given land. And I think a few years later, 2 or 3 years later, Zambia went from an food importing country to a food exporting country. So that was the impact of just a few hundred farmers. Not because...
And the fact of the matter was, most of Africa, was self-sustaining when the white farmers were there. That was even in Africa, for instance, in Tanzania. The white farmers were exporting food. So when Tanzania got independence, they were one of the major food exporters in the 60s. And that was also in Zambia and Zimbabwe. But then once the nationalization took over all the farms, then the capacity to produce went away, and dependency on foreign aid became more prevalent.
I mean, now that we're not living in Tanzania anymore, we can also say it's a socialist country. It has been since independence, and the ANC is a socialist or communist government. And what Mugabe was doing is basically the same thing. So it's partly socialism or centralized rulership. That's the issue.
So if we look at, I'm looking at Zimbabwe's astrological chart, and essentially it did really well in the beginning from 1980s, because that was the time when it could make money. But then overall, in spite of having a great land, at the current state, unless there's a major revolution in Zimbabwe, there is really no positive news that's coming out of Zimbabwe. So recently they had a shift of power. Mugabe dropped his power 30 years later. And we're looking at a very difficult time, actually. There's some relief in 2030. But before that, Zimbabwe is not coming out of anything. In fact, both South Africa and Zimbabwe are going to go through a very difficult time this year and next year. Financially, they'll be struggling, and then Zimbabwe basically will have to have a new government, if possible, in about 3 years. And maybe when they like if there's a revolution and ZANU goes away, or there's some different type of government that comes in, then that might actually help save Zimbabwe, because the chart of Zimbabwe is really bad.
Okay.
I mean, there's nothing, and it really did well in the 80s after independence, and then it did well even in the early 90s. And if you look at the chart, it really sees that. I remember going there in 93 and it was amazing. And then in 95, it just started going downhill within a few years. And so now we are still looking at a situation where it's really, really bad. And it will continue to be bad for...
until 2030, basically.
2030, there's some relief. I mean, right now, this year, next year is really bad. Like, it will get worse.
I mean, relief sounds a bit dire for a country that's so fertile and so rich in water. And I mean, people are very educated in general, or they have been,
right,
etc.
No, they're very educated, very sophisticated, really good people. But the government, the environment is not very conducive. And we might see, I mean, right now we have seen immigrant migration from West Africa, and soon within maybe in 2 years' time, we might see an immigration from South Africa where people are just trying to get out and go away. So in Zimbabwe, it's easy because you can easily run away to a neighboring country, or Zimbabwe is surrounded by countries. So you'll find some of them already came out. I mean, I know a few white Zimbabweans. In fact, there was a story where this person was a white farmer in Tanzania. He got kicked out. He went to Zambia. He got kicked out. He went to Zimbabwe. And finally, now his son came back to Tanzania. And now, again, because of the recent changes in Tanzanian politics, I'm not sure whether he's there but he had to close down because most people in Tanzania have to close down their shops.
He's the guy in doing the avocado business in Beira?
The avocado and the coffee business.
Yeah. That's quite a sad story. I mean, it's so crazy because the history repeats itself.
Yeah, and I remember in the last 20 years, last 8 years or 9 years, he's invested maybe $4 to $5 million. And now there's nothing to show of. So,
yeah, it's quite crazy.
And Tanzania, for instance, is an incredibly rich country. It's incredibly fertile. There's everything you can possibly think. But because of the government policies, people are in poverty and can't do anything. So,
I mean, maybe one thing that I would also like to mention is that Zimbabwe has some really old ruins, stone circle ruins. And there's a lot of, I mean, actually, there's very few information on the early history of Zimbabwe, but it's a lot of evidence that society there was once very sophisticated. And I mean, it's not really a kind of backwardish country in that sense. So
no, it is fertile. It has water. It has a lot of minerals. In fact, it has a lot of gold, and they were mining gold in the 12th and 13th century.
Yeah, maybe earlier even now.
Yeah, even earlier than that. But there is evidence that Arabs and Indians would buy gold all the way from the 11th, 12th century. And, we're talking about civilization that was even more advanced than when Europe was probably at that time.
I mean, there was even mentioning, I think Plinius, one of the Roman writers, wrote about a town, a large coastal town which today would be in Zimbabwe. So goes back quite a while. Did you also look at the horoscopes maybe of Mugabe? Because
I don't have his chart. So I didn't.
I mean, it's not so important, but
yeah, he's out anyway.
I mean, again, getting back to the both countries, if you would have to pick an archetype for or the root destinies of these two countries, what archetype would you assign to these nations?
Zimbabwe, if I looked at this as a person, is they are very. Zimbabwe is like the people are very good, and this is how you reflect in the mind of the people. But then you look at Zimbabwe as, let's say, as a country, which you would reflect as a person, is that is a beggar, is a destitute.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and that's why I said Zimbabwe, there's no hope unless there's a revolution. I mean, they're always broke. There's absolutely no development. There's always problem with the government. So the government is constantly fighting amongst themselves. So the people have nowhere to go. And the people are kind of stuck. And they're very creative. They're really good. But the politics is really difficult. The only person who really ends up doing very well is the leader.
Yeah.
So Mugabe ended up staying there for 30 years, otherwise he would have been gone. And he had to be a dictator in order to be able to stay there for so long. So we have a new president in Zimbabwe, and whether he has a good heart or not, more than likely he's going to end up doing the same thing. But he is, he just came on, and by 2020-21 he'll be out.
Okay.
So then there'll be some changes in 2020-21. 21 will be actually a better year for Zimbabwe with new hope and for about 3 years, and then. But it's not going to come out. There'll be some relief, temporary relief, for a couple of years, maybe 2 or 3 years, and then it just goes back down. So the real, I think basically in 2030 there'll be some relief, and the only hope right now, if nothing happens, if there's no change, we are looking at 2048 when things will improve for Zimbabwe.
Improve means that there's a whole different direction, or it's just a short intermittence?
No. Now, once in 2000, these short intermittent ones will be the ones that we'll see. Let's say in 2021, I think.
Okay.
Yeah, in 21, 22, you'll see some. 21, 22, 23 will be better, and 2024. So you might find, and even maybe, 2024. So you might find for 5-6 years Zimbabwe will do well, and this is intermittent, though it's overall it won't. Oh. And then from 2048 we might see a big change. So there has to be a lot of changes between now and then before Zimbabwe actually wakes up. So I would pretty much, if you look at 2048, we're pretty much right of Zimbabwe right now, unless there's a revolution.
Yeah. And what about South Africa? If it was a person, would it be a schizophrenic person, or what would it look like?
No, Zimbabwe was a beggar. It was a very depressed.
I mean, Zimbabwe is also very homogeneous, no, in some sense, which South Africa is not, because.
So there's a lot of. It's like a very poor. Zimbabwe is like a very poor artist who's never ever going to succeed until 2048. South Africa is completely different. South Africa has some benevolence in it. It's a very industrial country. It will do very well, and it did very well since it gained independence, frankly. And people expected it to really be where they are today. Unfortunately for South Africa is that, unlike Zimbabwe, they will do very well over time, but not right now. So this is a really well-meaning, hard-working country. So if we put it as a person, it's a hard-working, well-meaning country, and so it will eventually do better that way. But right now, starting from I don't remember when Mandela died. Do you remember when Mandela died?
No idea.
It was quite recent, actually.
I mean, I
So
know that there is the famous Mandela syndrome, I think it's called, or the Mandela effect. Have you heard about that one? But it's a totally different subject because,
yeah.
yeah, just give
So
me that.
so
Mandela.
we're looking as South Africa is really going to go through a hard time, which is what they're doing right now. It's going to get worse. This year and next year is going to be really bad. In 2020, they're going to change. There'll be a change in the government, which will bring in some help and relief. But we will see that change improvement in 2021. And in 2021, we'll see some small changes. 2023, 2024 is when South Africa will come back again and do quite well. So 2024, 2025 will be much better.
And do you see from where this change is coming? I mean, from which direction? Is it coming from outside, from political change, or
political change? These are all political changes.
Inside. So that's
So, but basically, what's happening is that you see, unlike other African countries, there are a lot of Western influence and investment in South Africa. So those people who have invested in South Africa, where if you talk about the mines and farming is one aspect of it,
banks
but
also.
but South Africa is a really huge industrial monopoly. It's just like richer than even some of the Western countries. So there are a lot of people invested in South Africa around the world. So you'll find that unlike Zimbabwe, where the impact is very small and negligible in terms of the worldwide market, South Africans, if they do something stupid, the international community will actually come in and will meddle in it.
I mean, even Trump had made some remarks about South Africa, that they should get their act together. So that tells one how high this goes.
Exactly. Sure. So and South Africa, frankly, if something happens in South Africa, it affects globally.
Yeah.
If something happens in Zimbabwe, people won't even know. In fact, most people don't even know where Zimbabwe is. So, but when something happens in South Africa, it gets affected globally. So basically, this year and next year is very tough for South Africa. But next year is tough worldwide for a lot of countries anyway. And so there's going to be a major transition. And then in 2020, we're looking at a massive reorganization of the politics in South Africa, because people will suffer a great deal in 2019. So so that internal change, because there's a lot of bright people in South Africa, so they will take over and try to restore some sanity into South Africa, and then it will do better after that.
But can you see, for instance, if if there's anything toward regarding the current land issue? I mean, will there be a land reform or land redistribution? Can you see that, or do you think that the current land structure is basically will not be touched? I mean,
no, there will be land issues, but not so much. In fact, the problems will. Okay, so.
I mean, so sorry to. Maybe reframe the question. For instance, if some farmers just take a 2-year vacation and go to Australia, visit some relatives and work there, and come back, will they still have their land in South Africa and be owners of this land?
Well, if they abandon it completely, no. But if they have something maintaining the farms, they can come back and redo it.
Okay.
Yeah. So South Africa is a completely different story. They will not repeat the mistakes that has gone on in other African countries. And the whites and the Western nation will actually really protect them when it comes down to the land. But it also looks bad right now, but it doesn't look like a disaster like in Zimbabwe.
Okay, because right now it looks really a bit disastrous, and a lot of people are talking civil war or even
Yes.
separation of the Western Cape, for instance. A lot of people think that the Western Cape will split off and things like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. So what happens is when they do something, there's very good chance of that. Things are going to get worse this fall and next year,
Yeah.
and then maybe by then, by 2020 we'll see some resolutions. But next year will be really a shake-up time.
Yeah, but do you think that basically the country stays in the same geographical boundaries the next years, or do you think there's a chance it falls apart into different sectors?
It is possible that it might break into other sectors if it comes down to it. But right now, I don't see it coming to that point. But the potential is very high because the Africans cannot rule South Africa without the help of the whites and the Indians.
Yeah, but they should have known this in Uganda and Zimbabwe as well, but they didn't really.
Yeah. So, and Tanzania also,
Yeah.
So, but because of the investments, the key factor with South Africa is because of the Western influences and investments in South Africa. South Africa will not be allowed to go through what other Africans went through.
Okay.
So there will be interference to save it. So the only thing is that what they're going to do is there's going to be an internal revolution where somehow things will be reorganized by 2020 for the better of everyone.
Okay, at least there's a kind of a time frame that's not so far out.
No, in fact, South Africa is very good. It will do well at certain points. It's just going through a rough period, and I would say that it will do well, especially from 2025. Now it will do well now. Once it deals with these little challenges, it will still come back.
One other thing that will be my last question, at least, is: do you see any significant Chinese influence in South Africa, South African interior affairs? I mean, they're also a Maoist country, and South Africa is now a basically communist-ruled country, though nobody mentions that. There should be some similarities, and there is, of course, Chinese influence in the economy in South Africa. But could you see that there is political meddling or influence from China?
Definitely, there's definitely. I mean, you see, what happens is South Africa is going to be like the Afghanistan of Europe.
It was for the British, especially, because the Boer Wars, I think, they cost Britain so much money that it was their second Afghanistan, basically.
Exactly. So now here, what's going to happen is that Western nations and Chinese will be fighting a economic war. But in this case, the Chinese won't have so much influence, although they'll be able to align with the poor, which was the majority of the Africans. But then in this particular case, in South Africa, Chinese are not going to win, and they will not be able to do what they did in other parts of Africa.
Like Zambia, for instance, or
Zambia, everywhere. I mean, the Chinese have gone everywhere in Africa, and they've capitalized the markets. They have really managed to do so well, which they won't be allowed in South Africa for a lot of reasons.
Yeah.
So I don't think they're going to win in South Africa, while in other parts of Africa, they've really dominated the economies in all of those, in most African countries.
I mean, at least the good thing about Chinese influence in Africa is that they are not intending to destabilize countries, what the West usually does. I mean, the West is interested in basically harvesting countries and then kicking their economies down so that they can buy assets cheaply. And the Chinese usually don't do that so far. And
well, not yet. But then when they have huge investments in countries and they realize that they'll lose all of that, then inevitably they also will start doing the same thing.
Yeah, we have to see that yet happening. No. Okay, is there anything you would like to say about the special situation, and especially South Africa, I think, is the more volatile?
Yeah, I would say Zimbabwe is a disaster. South Africa will be a disaster for the next 2 years, and then it will come back. They really need to change their president, and people will wake up and realize that they need to do something better. And South Africa, I would still look at South Africa as it's very hopeful.
Okay.
And it will do well.
Good.
All right.
That's nice to hear so far.
Yeah.
And thanks a lot, and speak again later.
Mm-hmm.
Safe traveling.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.